I want you to introduce your speaker, please.
Okay, there we go. I had to get unmuted. Okay, it is an absolute pleasure to have Dr. Antonio Grillo-Lopez with us today. He was in my Rotary Club in San Diego, so we're friends, but I haven't seen him for a while. And Antonio is a doctor. He specialized in hematology-oncology at the University of Puerto Rico. He was the program director for hematology-oncology and held faculty appointments there, as well as at the University of Michigan. He was very involved in doing pharmaceutical research and was responsible for the development of Rituxan and Zevalin, which are both chemotherapy drugs, and very involved in curing lymphoma. He is active in the San Diego community. He's a member of the Rotary Club of La Jolla Golden Triangle. He's a past president there and on the board of directors, and he's chaired club service. He's a Rotary International Paul Harris Fellow, and it is an absolute pleasure for me to introduce Antonio to all of you.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you, Anna, and hello to all of you. Have a good day. It is a good day today. We'll talk about that later, perhaps. And it's a privilege for me to have the opportunity to address you. Let me see if I can get to my slides. Okay. We perhaps should be talking about remdesivir. If you have heard the news today, breaking news about remdesivir, but we might do that in the Q&A later on. We're going to talk about the great pandemic, the coronavirus of 2019. And Dale has told you about me. My background is in hematology and oncology, and I have had experience during my career in clinical research in working with a number of drugs for viral diseases like the ones noted here, and then for Rituxan for lymphoma, and other antivirals, biologicals, etc. Now, the virus, any virus, a virus is a submicroscopic non-bacterial pathogen. They are the most numerous type of biological entity. They contain genetic material that can be either DNA or RNA. They infect all types of life forms, and very importantly, they replicate only inside a living cell. In the host, they provoke an immune response that can be very strong, very severe. And here's that entity we're talking about. It's really not a cell. It is not really a living organism. It depends on the host to be able to replicate. It has an official name. It has been named SARS-CoV-2 virus, and it causes the COVID-19 disease in humans. Now, what are the weapons that we have at hand to work against this virus? First of all, mitigation. We're going to talk a little bit about that, and then immunity, antivirals, and others. I can't find a way to explain this any better than this particular cartoon that I found, probably in Facebook. John got infected today. He will know in 14 days. John thinks he is okay. He will infect 10 people. They will know in 14 days. Those 10 think they are okay. They will go out and party. They will infect 100 people. They will know in 14 days. So stay at home. No one knows who is infected. No one. And the way that John will infect you is that he will cough or sneeze and direct towards you a large number of droplets that are the larger particles, or aerosol, which are the smaller particles that are blocked by the N95 filter. And as you see here, those particles will go into your nose and throat, and the smaller ones particularly can go down to your lungs. So they go down your trachea, the bronchi, into your lungs, and at the very end of their trip, they reach these small sacs in your lungs that we call alveoli. And they're very important because that's where gas exchange occurs. That's where we get oxygen for our blood. That's where oxygenation occurs. And as you see, the virus is very happy inside these alveoli. 20 to 40% of those who test positive are asymptomatic, but they are contagious. There's a recent study that was published a couple of days ago that shows that asymptomatic persons have as much a viral load as anyone with symptoms. So the fact that someone does not cough, does not have fever, doesn't mean that they're not contagious. They are. Important in mitigation is to keep your distance. 6 feet is a rule of thumb. It is not the end all. It's just a rule of thumb, a guideline, and if you can keep even further away, it's better. There are a number of masks that can be used, and the best one, of course, is the N95 respirator mask. We'll see that later. There's also the surgical masks, and then at the end of the spectrum are the fashion designer masks. The N95, excuse me, the N95 is called N95 because it can stop 95% of particles, including virus. And the N95 comes not from the maker, but actually from a federal agency that regulates the use of that N95 title. And it's the National Institute for Occupational Medicine, Safety and Health. So they certify any maker. It's not just one maker. They can certify any maker that meets the criteria. Why mitigation? Because we wanted to not have all of our cases of COVID-19 occurring at the same time and overwhelming our hospitals. And we have been successful. For many reasons, we have not been successful in places like New York, New Orleans, Seattle, but in most of the US, we have been successful and our hospitals have not been overwhelmed. So we have to continue to follow all precautionary measures. We're slowly being told how these are going to be relaxed. We have to stay at home as much as possible. And please, don't take any medications or supplements other than your daily meds by your doctor, by prescription. Wearing a face mask is better than wearing a ventilator. Staying in your home is better than staying in an ICU. And praying is better than complaining. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the clinical course of the disease. Someone coughs, and let's say that 100 get infected. Of those 100, 30 will test negative, and 70 will test positive. Of those 70, 40 will be symptomatic. Of those 40, 20 will be hospitalized. Of those 20, 10 will go to intensive care. And of those 10, 5 will require intubation and will have to be placed on a ventilator. Of those 5, only 2 will survive. And this is how it happens. You get infected, there's an incubation period, then you develop symptoms or not, you're quarantined. Some people with symptoms have severe enough disease that they need to be hospitalized. And about half of those have to go to intensive care. About half of those will end up in a ventilator. If you're quarantined, chances are you will recover. If you're on a ventilator or you're hospitalized, some percent will recover. And of those who recover, greater than 95% will be immune, will have developed antibodies to the disease. Like I said, over 95% of those who recover develop immunity, and immunity can be cellular or humoral, but we're going to look particularly at antibodies, which is part of the humoral component of immunity. And this is what an antibody looks like in the eyes of an artist. It's a Y-shaped entity, and it binds to the virus here at the tips of this Y-shaped entity, where it says antigen, that should read virus. And this is how it does it. The antibodies are floating around in the blood, in the lymph, and they home to, they detect the virus, and they attach to it. This happens to be the spike protein of the virus, which is one of the more likely targets for the antibodies. Now, the two types of antibodies that we're most interested in are IgM and IgG. Immunoglobulin M is the first antibody type to appear, and it's shorter lasting. We'll see that in another slide in a graphical form. IgG, or immunoglobulin G, is longer lasting, appears a little bit later, and confers immunity. So this is the important one. This is the one that gives us immunity that's longer lasting. Now, these antibodies have been shown in the laboratory to neutralize the virus. They block attachment, prevent penetration of the host cell, and they interfere with uncoating of the RNA within the cell. And this is how it happens in graphic form. You're exposed to the virus, you get the infection. Shortly thereafter, you start developing IgM, one mnemonic device that will help you remember that this is the one that comes first is that M, you could say, stands for Marines. The Marines are always the first to fight, in this case, the virus. And then shortly after that, the IgG antibodies start to increase in your blood. They peak, and then they remain for hopefully a long period of time. So much for mitigation. Let's talk a little bit about immunity and antivirals. Immunity can be adaptive or acquired. The adaptive immunity is developed in response to an infection. It occurs after the fact. This is important, okay? Because the acquired immunity is developed in response to a vaccine, and it occurs before the fact being the infection. So here you have in a little bit more graphic form, the acquired immunity occurs before the infection, and the adaptive immunity occurs after the infection. And lately you've been hearing a lot about herd immunity. What is it? Why is it important? Well, before the existence of COVID-19, we were all vulnerable. Each one of these white squares, consider that it's one of us. It's a person. All of which are vulnerable because they have no prior exposure to COVID-19, no prior exposure to the virus. On the other hand, this is a situation where everyone has been exposed to the virus, and it's either immune or vaccinated. So how do we get from this to that? Well, the first thing that happens is that in this vulnerable population, one person appears and coughs, and three others around that person get infected. And those three and the other person, total four, cough, and they infect a few more. And so on and on and on until most of this population are infected. Or perhaps all of them. And they're not just infected, they're contagious. They can continue to spread the virus. But then recovery starts to occur. You know, the disease, if you recover, and 95% of people recover, on the average, you recover in 3, maybe 4 weeks. Yes, you'll have some fatigue remaining, lingering after that, but essentially you're recovered and you're immune. You are immune. We'll talk about vaccines later on. At this point, this person is immune because that person has recovered from the virus. The others are in the process of recovering, but are not yet immune. But eventually, others start to recover. Remember, the recovery rate is 95%, and more of them recover until you have this situation where the majority has recovered and is immune, and you have a minority that are still in red because they're still infected and contagious, but the others are safe because they have recovered, they have antibodies, they have immunity, except for this person right here, who is still vulnerable, who has neither acquired the virus, has not had the infection, and we don't have a vaccine for that person. So that person needs to be quarantined because that person is very vulnerable, and there are still some infected persons close by that can infect him or her. Later on, when practically everybody is immune, that person is relatively safe because there's a lot of people who are immune that are in between this person and the infected person. So this is where the herd effect starts to occur, okay? The majority of the herd is immune, and they're keeping this infected one away from the vulnerable one. So the chances of these two coming in contact and this one getting infected are minimized. Of course, the best situation is when there are no longer any infected persons around this one. And how do we achieve that? How do we get all of the herd to be immune? Well, there are at least 2 ways of doing this. And one is for everyone to get infected, survive, and develop immunity. Now, that is what I mentioned earlier, after the fact. After the fact, because they have had the disease and recovered. Another way that we can get to this situation is where all of these people have been immunized. They have had the vaccine. Now, unfortunately, we do not yet have a vaccine, but it will happen. It's a question of months. But there might always be 1 or 2 persons who have neither had the disease or received the vaccine, and they will not be immune. They're vulnerable, they're susceptible. Talk a little bit about California. As you know, we're number 1 in terms of population amongst all of the states. We're 3rd in area. We're 5th in coastline. We're a pretty large state, and we're a pretty big deal in terms of our economy being the 5th in the world. Unfortunately, we're also pretty big in terms of homelessness. We're 1st in the US with 180,000 homeless, and that's about 50% of the homeless population in the US. That's something that we need to address, and we need to do that fairly soon. Okay, we're number 1 in terms of tourism amongst all of the states, with about 270 million per year. And about 7% of those are from outside the US, so about 9 million. In terms of air travel, about 235 million arrivals at California airports, 18% are international, and close to 2 million come from China. In fact, we have had all along direct flights to and from Wuhan to several of our major airports as listed here. Why is that important? Because something very interesting has been happening in California, that makes us different from New York City and from other cities and states and that is that we have had probably less than what I expected would be our share of COVID-19. And if you look at influenza or influenza-like cases and COVID-19 cases over time, and each curve represents a year going back to 2016, every year there has been a little bit more influenza, but the year that we have had the most influenza has been in this year and end of last year, a huge peak, never seen before. And this was, again, end of 2019, beginning of 2020. And it was called influenza-like, because when some of these people were tested for influenza, they tested negative to influenza A. It is thought that they may have had influenza B. I tend to think that they probably had COVID-19, became immune, and that's why we haven't had so much COVID-19 as expected to date. Things may change. Depends on how we deal with mitigation from now on. Then COVID-19, so to speak, got invented, and all of a sudden, there's a huge peak in COVID-19, and this curve goes down. Why? Because all of the ones that were being called ILI, influenza-like illness, were transitioned to being called COVID-19 cases. So in terms of infection, we are number 32 amongst all of the states, in spite of the fact that we're a huge state with 40 million population. Hospitalized, we have less than expected deaths. We're number 29, that's less than expected. Why? Like I said, some percent of Californians are already immune. There are a couple of studies that have been done that show a 2 to 5% existing immunity. I think it's probably larger than that. The tests are not entirely 100% reliable, but anyways, that's what we have to date. And this is the test that most people have had when they get tested for COVID-19. It's the nasal swab. And vaccines and therapeutic agents are in clinical trials. There are probably 5 or 6 vaccines that are in humans already, that are being tested in humans in clinical trials, making good progress. A couple from companies in San Diego. Pfizer is developing such a vaccine also. Oh my goodness, there's an entity in the UK, I'm not remembering the name right now. They're working on a vaccine. They've had a lot of publicity. However, I think they're not going to be the first. I can tell you about that later on. And Queensland, Australia, they're also developing a vaccine at the university there. Development is also ongoing in China. I don't think I'll get that vaccine. I'll get one made in the USA, preferably. The important thing is to be informed, not scared, to follow recommendations, apply your common sense, be prudent, stay healthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We're all applauding for sharing all this information. I will make this video available as it's recording, and I'll share it to the club. If someone wants to share it on social media, is that okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Okay, let's open up to questions. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. I do.
Go for it.
This is Joan.
Yes.
Okay, I have that's a scary one. I have a friend coming in from England now, and he just flew in to England, to London from South Africa, and he was on a private plane, and they found a person that had the virus, and they they put everybody in to be separated, and he can't get out of London now. And he's coming out of London, but he's coming to my home. And how do I handle it? He can stay in another section of my house, but I'm trying to figure out what I can do that's safe, or can he not stay in my house at all?
My suggestion would be that that person has to be handled with gloves, literally, and with a mask, has to be
Yes.
quarantined, has to be tested, regardless of whether that person was tested before or not, has to be tested here as soon as he arrives. The test may come back negative. That doesn't mean that he cannot get infected. It means he's not actively infected at that point. Remember, there are some false positives and negatives to the test, so take that with a bit of a grain of salt. But the person needs to be quarantined effectively, taking all the possible precautions for 14 days. And if he tests negative at the beginning, has to be retested probably after those 14 days.
He's been tested twice there. He was tested as he got off the plane, and they tested him again, and it was negative. But is he safe in my house? Can I allow him in my house? Or, I mean, if we set up a quarantine situation, or does he have to be someplace else?
What options do you have?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
It's difficult, a person whose family or has a very good friend and who doesn't have other options, the Rotarian in you will say, let's keep him at home, but have him in a separate part of the home, quarantine, don't have him navigate the rest of your home, have him wear a mask. You, anytime that you interact with him to bring food or reading materials or whatever, make sure you wear gloves and a mask, and take all of the possible precautions.
Okay, but do you think it's safe, or is the truth of the matter, he should not be in the house? Is that what you're really saying?
I don't know if I should commit myself.
We have to move on to different questions.
Frankly, I don't know what I would do in that situation. I think it also depends on, are you high risk yourself?
Yes, I am.
So, that comes into the equation also. Does the person have any other options? If there is another option, you might consider doing that. Is there anyone else in your home that might be at high risk?
No, just me.
So it's a difficult decision. I'm not sure I can give you a yes or no answer. I can only name what the precautions might be that you could take, and to look for, see what options you have.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have taken so much time. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're very welcome.
We have to move on to different questions. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. And it's 1:00. If anybody has to leave, that's fine. We just want to continue because we have some questions. Michelle, we have a question for Michelle.
You were very helpful.
Doctor, once you're immune, how long is that immunity for?
The quick answer to that is we don't know.
Okay.
However, we are in a situation where we're learning day to day, where on January the 1st of 2020, this is how much we knew about COVID-19.
Yeah.
Nothing. Okay. However, in my last literature search, I found over 900 publications since that day. So we're learning. We learn every day by little steps, but we gather more and more data. So we have to accept that we're where we're at. And I'm not sure I've addressed your question. Can you repeat that?
How long is your immunity for?
Yeah.
Once you are immune?
So I was saying all of that because we have to then, not having directly applicable experience or information, we have to rely on the information that we have that can be translated from other experiences with influenza, with different viral illnesses. And what we have learned from those other illnesses and from antibodies in general is that they do last. They do last. I have personally had an experience in one of my research projects where patients were given an antibody, and the antibody that was given to them lasted 6 months after it was administered, lasted in their blood for 6 months after it was administered, even though they were not producing any, because this was given externally. So IgG antibodies tend to last relatively long when they are generated within the patient internally as a response to vaccination or to an actual infection. However, the other thing to keep in mind is that analogous to influenza, we may be in a situation where come end of the year, influenza season, we get another COVID-19 season with a little variation like happens with influenza. This is why we have to get the influenza vaccine every year, because the influenza virus changes a little bit every year. The vaccine is effective, but you get a little change in the virus and then you have to make changes in the vaccine also. So we don't know, but we may be headed in that particular direction, which is okay, you know, if we develop an effective vaccine.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. Sandy, you have a question?
Yes. Thank you, Doctor.
A pleasure.
2 questions. You said you have to have a mask, and obviously the N95 is the best one. If you have a mask and you're in 6 to 10 feet of somebody, are you really having a chance of getting it as long as you're in the mask? I mean, I'm not asking you to be God here, but that's the first question. And the second one, you may have answered it because it says, you said that once you become immune, you can't pass it on to somebody else, or you can?
Once you become immune, the chances are that you have dealt with most of the virus that was inside your body. Excuse me. So you're probably not going to be infectious anymore. You fought the virus, you won, and that's why you have excess antibody circulating. So you're probably okay.
Okay, and then a follow-up to that, probably okay. If you think you're okay, I'm going to ask this question. Do you
I'm
still
sorry, I
wear a
didn't
mask?
answer your, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I didn't answer your question about the masks.
Yeah.
The best being the N95s, but again, it's not an N100
Right.
for a reason, right?
Got it.
So there's always a chance that you might get virus. And sometimes it's not the mask itself, not the material that the mask is made of, but actually the fit to your face. You know, droplets, aerosols may come in on the sides of the mask, depending on how well it fits on your face. So that's a possibility. Or you may be wearing a mask that is not an N95, that's perhaps a level 3 surgical mask, and they are not as good. Or you're wearing a designer mask and they're the worst, but they look good. And the chances of you getting infected increase as you work your way down level 3 to level 2 to level 1 designer masks.
So one last question then. In your opinion, we will probably be wearing masks during flu season for a long time then?
Well, I have great hopes that when the antibody tests become available, a large number of the population will already be positive because they've either had the disease or had antibodies even before. Now, remember, when I say had the disease, it doesn't mean they had symptoms. 20 to 40% of our population who has the disease doesn't have symptoms. So that's why broad testing is necessary. And I think it's going to become more important to do the antibody tests because that's what tells you if you're immune or not. the nasopharyngeal swab test tells you if you have the virus or not. So the antibody test is going to become more and more important, and hopefully it'll become broadly available.
Thank you for what you've said, for making yourself available to the 360 million people that live in the United States.
Thank you. Any questions?
I have. Yeah, Antonio, with the N95 masks, what I'm hearing is that they're trying to save those for hospitals and healthcare workers, and that the general population probably shouldn't use the N95. Do you agree with that?
I think they are trying to do that, and rightfully so. I had a number of N95s and I donated them, because I feel that those who are at the forefront of this battle against the virus are the ones that need to have them. And that includes one of my sons, who is a maxillofacial prosthodontist. And when he does surgery, and he has been doing emergency surgery, he has to dress up like something out of Star Wars, which includes wearing an N95, a shield, all sorts of protection, total body protection, and even cover his shoes. So I think those are the people, the surgeons, the people who are working on these patients at emergency rooms and ICUs. They're the ones that need to use the masks. Now, having said that, it was just published a couple of days ago that there is a new easy method for sanitizing, sterilizing the N95s that involves hydrogen peroxide vapor, so to speak. The masks are put in a chamber that many hospitals have for other purposes. They're left there for 6 or 7 hours, and then they are treated to take away the remnants of the hydrogen peroxide, and then they can be used the next day. So they're processed overnight and can be used the next day. And they can be used up to 20 times when the masks then just normally start to deteriorate. So that's pretty good news. I think the N95s are going to become more and more available. In the meantime, I'm personally wearing a level 3, but I try not to go out. I try to stay at home as much as possible and go only when it's absolutely necessary, like to purchase medications or to the market.
Great. Thank you so much, Antonio. I think, Tom, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question. We hear a lot about the malaria drug, and I don't know is any benefit for that or just a rumor.
Yeah, there was great hope for chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, either one, particularly in combination with azithromycin, Z-Pak, because of good results that were initially presented from a well-known and respected group of investigators in Marseille, France. And what struck me when I first saw their report was that they did show that patients had a significant decrease in viral load. Their studies were not very well designed. They were not very well reported. There's been all sorts of criticism about their study, and appropriately so, because it was really not. They could have done it much better. But it's undeniable that they did see a decrease in viral load. That has not stood up to the test in other studies, but other studies have not necessarily used the same efficacy parameters as they did. So I think it's still up in the air, but as of today, I'm surprised no one has asked me about remdesivir. Those are the breaking news today. Anthony Fauci said on TV, I see Alex smiling, so he probably heard this. He said on TV that Gilead Corporation from California has had this antiviral in clinical trials now for some time for a variety of different indications, viral illnesses of different kinds, and now for COVID-19. And Dr. Fauci leaked information on TV this morning that they are having good results in one of their latest clinical trials. So this is the breaking news for the day.
Thank you.
People shouldn't just go out and have their doctors prescribe the hydrochloroquine for them.
No, at this time, I would say no. And in my opinion, you shouldn't do that anyway to preempt the illness. I think if it is going to be useful, it's probably going to be useful in patients that already have the illness and are progressing from mild to more severe symptoms. But it would not be number one on my list at this point in time. As for remdesivir, I think that there's a lot of hope and enthusiasm today. The actual clinical trial results are coming soon, so to speak. But Dr. Fauci was very enthusiastic, and that has generated tremendous hope, enthusiasm, and everyone is talking about this. So look it up on Google as soon as you leave the meeting.
Thank you, Antonio. I think, oh, Raina, okay.
Question, I'm sorry. I haven't really spoken anything today, but I have a quick question. You're like, say we're in a grocery store or Target or wherever, right? And we all have our masks on. My question is if somebody sneezes, whether it be myself or any of us, I have a sneezing fit or I have a cough and I'm sneezing into the mask and I'm doing everything right. Should, as a consumer or the person who's nearby, should they be worried? Or if you're doing it appropriately, you're sneezing or you hachoo, and you leave your mask on and then you discard it when you leave the store, are you doing that the right way so you're protecting people around you? Or should I be worried as a person who's right nearby and then somebody sneezed into their mask just because you're like ridiculously like, oh my God, you know?
Well, that person should run from you as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, if you're not wearing an N95, and I haven't seen anything that says that the N95s work in reverse.
Okay.
But actually, with wearing a mask, you are protecting those around you.
Correct.
But still, they have to take all possible precautions.
Okay.
And there are different reasons why you wear a mask. You wear a mask to protect yourself, but you wear a mask also to protect others around you. I wear a mask because it's really useful, even if it's a designer mask, level 1, because I put it on, let's say I'm going to the drugstore,
Mm-hmm.
and people see me wearing a mask, and they'll stay away from me. They'll keep their distance. And if they come too close, I fake a cough. I go, that drives people away. So, the mask serves several purposes. I'm joking, sorry.
That's funny. All right, I think we're gonna have to close our meeting. It's 1:15. We went way over time. Thank you, Antonio, for your time.
A pleasure. Thanks to all of you. A pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Del, for bringing Antonio. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here, our guest. Thank you, Rod, for joining us, and Alex. Mwah! Love you all.
Bye.
Bye.